All right, good morning to my friends around the world. It's afternoon, and I think in Romania. It's a little before noon in England, and here in America, it's early. But it's going to be a good day. And listen, I know in America, today's a day that everybody's been stressing over, it feels like, for way too long. And I wrote a little note to our church this morning. I just want to share with you the verse I shared with them. It's Daniel the prophet. He said this. He said, he changes, speaking about God, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So I think out of that, there's a real powerful truth that takes place. God's will be accomplished today. And he will put in office in our country who he purposes. We don't have to like it, but it is what he's going to do. And so we rest in that. We got a lot maybe to think about. We got nothing to worry about because we serve a king who is above all and is in all and is through all. So just be encouraged by that today. Go do your thing, but let's just, at the end of the day, rejoice that the true king is on his throne. All right. Love you guys. Hey, listen, we're jumping into 1 Peter chapter 4. We're finally kind of moving along, but he's still keeping in line with this theme of suffering. And, it's a timely word for us. I think that we understand that we live in crazy times. And we should look at this because I believe that the church, if we're not careful, loses our power by trying to appeal too much to the world. And I know that may sound old and cliche, but it's true. And there is a stark contrast and getting starker and a deeper divide every day of how the world pursues life and how Christ has called us to pursue life. The question is, which path will we lean toward? And this is the conversation that Peter has with his folk. And let me read it to you, and then we'll see what it says. He says, therefore, now he's just finished speaking of the fact that, that Christ suffered and died. He says, therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their recklessness and wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to the regard to the spirit. Now, so what do we make of this? Well, I think there's three movements of thought, and so we're going to kind of walk through that today in the brief amount of time that we have. So he's speaking of the fact that Christ conquered sin. He conquered it because of his attitude, and that's the concept that he wants us to go with. He was done with sin. And so it says, therefore, since he suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude. Be willing to suffer in your body in order to be done with sin. And this is his deal. I think it's there's an old saying, sin's a terrible taskmaster, right? And it's true. How many of you are old enough to look back at your life and go, I got a few regrets? Here's what I know. Every regret that you have will be because you violated a principle in Scripture. Every one. I mean, it's just true. You have very few regrets that don't line up like that. And so I think it's important that we will do that. And in his day, Peter was concerned that people would think, okay, if I ease up on my holiness, and then maybe persecution will ease up too. So if I back off, persecution will cease. Well, the reality is, in this whole text is, persecution in that sense, judgment is going to come. whether you sin and the persecution and judgment that comes from God on that, or you don't and the world will persecute you, you're going to be persecuted. And I mean that not in a terrible sense from a God perspective, but either if we choose sin, we can expect the world to persecute, the world to love us and God to be disciplining us. If we choose to engage in not engage in sin, then we can expect the world to get pressure on us. So the question is, which one do we want against us? The world or God? That's the question that comes up. So Peter knows that we're going to be tempted to go along to get along, right? And we see that in our world today. We have eased up so much. No one even defines sin anymore, except in big vague terms, like bigotry or whatever term you want to use. But the reality is, God is very specific about what sin is. It's a violation of His standard of holiness, and it's a violation of two commands: a failure to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and a failure to love your neighbors yourself. Those two things are what we are called to live up to. So there's no good outcome in choosing not to honor God and honor man. And this is his point. The world has defined sin in ways that aren't consistent with what God says. Therefore, the world has no morality about it. We're right now we're listening to men and others talk about who's more moral. Well, I would argue there's very little morality anywhere in the world, not even within the church, because we have no longer defined sin as sin. And so what happens is we've become desensitized to it because we've just allowed our ear gates and our eye gates to allow anything to come in, and we've become numb to it. We are that frog in the frying pan, so to speak, where the heat's just turned up just a little. So we tolerate a lot of things that shouldn't be tolerated. And so Peter is trying to help us understand that. So don't let persecution be a cause for us to fall back, because persecution is going to come. It's going to come no matter who's in office, whatever administration is in there. There will be. I mean, the Christians are going to be persecuted. No man will insulate us from that. And so we have to talk about, Peter says, let me give you some tips on this whole thing. And the first thing he says, and we're going to jump right into it, remember how Christ suffered. This is what he's saying. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in his body is done with sin. Don't run from suffering. That's what he's saying. What did the writer of the Hebrews say? For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He knew the outcome of the cross, and so he didn't run from that, right? So listen, he had been being persecuted his whole life. Do you remember? You remember the persecution that took place when they tried to kill the firstborn, and they had to flee to Egypt to hide out because Herod was trying to kill all the male children to destroy the King of Kings, because he didn't know who he was. He thought, I'll kill them all. And so there was persecution from the very outset. And then there was the temptation of where he was tempted in every way, it says. But he was tempted. And Christ, Satan tempted Christ in every way imaginable. And then death came. Now, death wasn't, they tried to do that all through his life. Remember when he gets to the cliff and they intend to throw him off of the cliff? And I love it because they're going to lay hands on him and they're going to throw him off the cliff because they're angry with him. But it says he just walked right through the crowd. It was like he had this Teflon coating where they just couldn't grab him and do what they wanted to. But they wanted to. They wanted to kill him, and they finally found a way. But he says, listen, when you have suffered in the body, when you've decided that I'm going to, whatever suffering comes, there's a greater joy on the other side, you're done with sin. Our problem is we live too much for this life, not enough for the next life. This is what Peter's been stressing the whole way. Your life will be richer if you keep heaven in mind. That's not to say that we ignore this life, not to say we're not in the moment in this life. But while we've got one eye on this life, we have another one somewhere else. Just what happens for parents every day, right? You're living life, and you got one eye on your kid, right? I mean, you're doing your thing, but you're always mindful of that. And it keeps us in balance. And this is what he's saying here when it comes to the suffering of Christ. We reckon ourselves dead to sin. That's what Paul told the Roman church. Reckon yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ. And so if we want to defeat this sin principle, and we want to endure whatever's coming, let's be willing to embrace suffering. The one who won't embrace suffering will never live the life that God's called him to. And so, listen, just understand it's going to come. So that's the first thing. Remember Christ, how he suffered and he was victorious. Have that attitude. Okay? This is number one. Number two, remember God's will. This is what he says. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. When you've died to sin, then you're no longer trying to grovel and find yourself at the top of the heap, so you have more power, more money, more whatever than everybody else. We have flipped the world upside down, Christ has through us. And so now we become servants to a world, just as Christ became servants to a world. And so we know that we serve the living God, and He's our master. And so we no longer live for sin, and that's what He says. Listen, God's desire for you and me is always better than whatever desire we can imagine for us. And it's just true. And when we quit fighting God, I spent half my life writing out what I wanted, holding it up to God. Hey, sign right here, God, and I'll be on my way, right? Just rubber stamp what I want to do. It never pays good dividends when I do that. But if I say, Lord, not my will, but yours be done, it's an amazing ride. And so this is what he's saying here. Listen, in the midst of suffering that's coming, this is what happens. Now, so we don't let sin reign in our lives. We realize, and listen, here's what we do, and Paul understood this in Romans 6. Shall we sin so that grace may abound? Listen, we in America love to hide out under grace. And grace is an amazing thing, and it's lavished, and it's grace upon grace. But that doesn't give us a license to sin. Simply because God is gracious when we do, doesn't mean that we should then do the sin. And this is what Peter is trying to say. And then he says, look, sin has never done anything but destroy mankind. And so he said, I don't want you to sin. I don't want you to sin. I don't want you to engage in that because you think persecution will ease up on you. Bear up underneath it. And so this is what he says in verse 3 through 6. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do. How many of you can attest to that, right? I mean, I can. I've spent too much time living in lust and maybe not orgies and some of these things, but debauchery, lust, drunkenness, whether that's an addiction to anything, right, that overtakes us, carousing and detestable idolatry. You've done enough of that. So you've decided, you and me, hey, I'm not doing that anymore. This is the deal. A lot of us haven't decided we're not doing that anymore. We still keep our toe in the water, and he's going to be done with sin. It never pays good dividends. And so let's just remember Christ's attitude. Remember God's will, that he's always better at directing our lives than we are. And third, let's just realize that sin has destroyed mankind. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Well, why won't you? Are you feeling that pressure? Why don't you just live and let live? Why do you have to condemn this? And why do you have to be against that? And why do you have to take a stand for this? See, they want us to join them in that. They want us to celebrate injustice. They want us to although in the name they call it justice, they want us to celebrate an injustice. They want us to celebrate the death of the unborn. They want us to celebrate division. And he's saying, why don't you join us in that? Because I don't belong to this world. They're going to have to give an account. This is the sober truth, verse 5. But they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Listen, those in the past who have already gone and us who are living will all meet the fate of judgment of a holy God. Those of us who are Christ followers have been given a pardon. Someone has paid our debt. We're going to walk free, but not the rest. And so let's don't align ourselves with those who have been condemned. Let's align ourselves with those who have been pardoned. And this is what he says. For this reason, the gospel was preached to those who are now dead. That doesn't mean he went and preached to some dead folk. It means that the gospel was preached. The good news was preached even before Christ came. and went through the suffering of the cross and the glory of the resurrection. And so he says, for this reason, it was preached to them so that even those might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the Spirit. It's because it's always about that. Abraham, by faith, believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he lived in the Spirit. And so this is the point, and this is the message today, and I think it's pretty pertinent because I'm telling you, whatever happens at the end of this day or this month or whatever, persecution is going to heighten and turn up the heat a little bit. You and me have three things that we remind ourselves of. Christ suffered and found great victory, and I'm going to have that attitude. For the joy of this suffering, I'm going to endure it. I'm going to endure it because of the joy of being a Christ follower. And then I'm going to recognize that God's will for me always supersedes what man thinks I should do or shouldn't do. And I'm going to recognize that there is a judgment that comes, and sin pays a terrible, it's destructive to mankind. I'm going to choose the latter. How about you? Love you guys. Be safe out there. Be bold out there today for Christ. Do your thing and sleep well tonight, no matter what happens. Love you guys.